So first of all, nice to meet you, Don. Nice to see you
Yeah, same here.
in person. So yeah, you've got the questions over there. I've got your last book over here. So
Yeah,
let's
I'll hold it up as well.
yeah, nice. I'll put it in
And
a
the other one that is interesting is this nurturing independent learners.
yes. I
That's
have
the
a
one
question.
that talks about why smart kids get smarter.
Yes, I have a question about that later on. So you mentioned in one of your emails that you have visited Holland
Yes, a couple of times.
a couple of times.
Actually, there was a man named Joop, Joop Myers, who was a postdoc and came to our lab.
I see.
And I lectured at the University of Amsterdam. And then I was at the University of uh, Nijmegen and the University of Utrecht.
All right.
So we loved Holland.
That's nice.
It
So
was really good.
you have some experience. Great. Well,
Yeah,
let me start by asking you my first question for you. Could you tell us a bit about the work you do for the Melissa Institute and what it stands for, and maybe a bit about the history?
sure. First of all, let me thank you for the invitation to present. As I mentioned, I had the good fortune of visiting the Netherlands and presenting at various universities a couple of times, so I have a great fondness for your country and admiration for your psychology folks.
Thank you.
Let me put the answer to your question in a little context. I was a professor at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. Waterloo is about an hour west of Toronto for 40 years and took early retirement some 22 years ago. And at that point, I became research director for the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention and Treatment of Victims of Violence in Miami, Florida. Melissa was a young lady who was an undergraduate at the Washington University in St. Louis. And a tragic thing happened. She was carjacked and brutally murdered. Now, when such a tragedy like that befalls an individual, their family, friends, the community at large, one of the ways that people cope with trauma, and as I could share with you, I've been heavily involved in that topic, people transform their pain into something good that could come of it. So Melissa's parents decided to create an institute in her name. The institute itself is not a direct hands-on institute, but application. It's designed to give science away. So we work in a consultative mode with school boards, public defenders, government officials, psychiatric facilities. And we have an annual conference each May. And I would encourage the folks watching this interview to visit our website, which you'll post, which is www.melissainstitute.org. And on that website are many other papers by myself that people could follow up this presentation with. But most appropriate for education, which is your audience, the Melissa Institute has attempted to prevent violence by bolstering resilience in high-risk children and their families. Interestingly, it turns out that there's a high likelihood of a correlation between the level of reading comprehension that students evidence and the level of violence they also emit. So your readers can actually go on the Melissa Institute website and download for free 500 movies of the best teachers in Canada, Mississippi, and Florida on ways to teach children to read. Because it turns out in the United States, if you can get children to read by grade 3, they rarely, if ever, get in trouble with the law. So one of our activities has been to bolster resilience. And we just had a conference on that, and you can read online the handouts on who's at high risk and ways that schools, communities, and clinics can coordinate efforts to identify high-risk children and to put them on a more successful trajectory. There are many other items that I'll comment on in terms of preventing gun violence, improving report card activities in the way in which you can improve the principals engaging this. So a major activity for me in my retirement has been involvement with the Melissa Institute. And hopefully this interview will introduce folks to all of those resources, not only by me, but we have many other contributors that they could access as well.
Great. So, what does a day for you look like at the Melissa Institute? Could you give us a little insight of your daily activities?
Well, it turns out that the Melissa Institute has a small staff, mainly consultation, education for parenting and bullying prevention and the like. So I'm not down there full time. I actually live in Buffalo, New York, and have grandchildren up in Toronto. So I spend like most people living up north, I spend my winters in Florida, which is a wise thing to do.
Yeah.
And I go over to the Melissa Institute and typically consult or meet with various to improve this. We did a conference on how to bolster resilience in LGBTQ, that is gay and lesbian, high risk, especially transgender youth. We've done consultation and conferences on how to bolster resilience in victims of human trafficking. We've done work on domestic violence. So depending upon the particular topic and group, I will end up consulting and training with the staff of the Melissa Institute. That's sort of a typical activity day.
This year there has been quite some shootings already. And I'm referring to, for example, the high school shooting in Texas. How do you look at those kinds of events? What did it do to you when you saw the last shooting? And how would the Melissa Institute find ways to solve these problems?
Well, let me note that prior to the recent shooting in Santa Fe, Texas, there was a prior shooting in Parkland, Florida, which is right nearby the Melissa Institute in Miami. And I must tell you that given those school shootings and the prior school shootings in Columbine and Newtown and so forth, it's very sad and very grief-stricken. I must tell you that the way I personally cope with grief and the aftermath and being impressed by those students is to transform my grief into social action. So the Melissa Institute, with the help of the scientific board, put together a toolkit that's online, which is designed to do two things. One is it's designed, the first tools, to nurture a dialogue between people who have very diverse views on gun safety. So you have in the United States those who are members of the National Rifle Association who hold on to the Second Amendment and don't want to budge on gun control, while on the other hand you have advocates of gun control. So we have put together this set of discussion points to see if we can facilitate a dialogue. At least in the United States, there's no way to ban guns. Okay? The second part of this toolkit that is really relevant to your audience is how to identify high-risk children. And most importantly, how to intervene in a successful fashion, how to increase school safety. So there is no quick fix or magic bullet to reduce the likelihood of these kinds of cultural events. But I think, being an academic, I have tried to marshal the evidence on how to initiate and perhaps implement some kinds of gun control fashion, and most importantly, how to make schools safer. There is an entire checklist for principals on what they could do at school-wide levels with high-risk kids in order to identify these procedures. I should note that we also have on the Melissa Institute website the link to these reading comprehension literacy, but we also have a website there that you could link to also for free called Teach Safe School, which is all the ways that schools can reduce the likelihood of bullying. Bullying is often a forerunner. Last point I would make on this is I have given presentations that are online as to how to make a violent youth. How do you get from being born to the point that you kill Melissa? I mean, that's a really interesting question. And we can start to note that violent behavior, whether it's school shooting or other forms of violence, rarely, if ever, occur without some forewarning signs. And from my perspective, the most valuable tool is peer warning. Peers often know, more so than adults, who's potentially at high risk. So I invite your audience to look at those resources. I will also indicate my email address. So if any of your audience members have follow-up questions to this interview or to what's on the website, they could feel free to contact me via the Melissa Institute website or dhmeich, M-E-I-C-H, at AOL.com. dhmeich.
It will be in the description box, so I'll make sure, I'll be sure of that.
Great. So it's really sad and a really tragic problem, not only for the United States, but for other countries as well.
We don't have gun violence in Holland. We never have high school shootings because we don't have guns. We're not allowed to possess any guns.
Well, the Netherlands has had their share of shootings, in the sense of other kind of terrorists and so forth. It's a universal problem, but I wish we could learn from your good lesson about guns.
So let's move on to the next one. Let's go to the field of education, which has my particular interest and of my readers and viewers as well. Can you share the work you are involved in with working with students and teachers?
We, with a colleague named Andrew B. Miller at the University of Toronto, we did a set of interesting studies on trying to identify children who achieve, who get smarter and smarter in school over a period of time, versus those students who fall further and further behind. In the United States, for instance, when students enter school, there's marked diversity. And children enter school by as many as 1 or 2 grades apart as they enter school. And moreover, one of the distinguishing characteristics is that children, especially of poverty or children who have been exposed to multiple adverse childhood experiences or who come from deprived environments, enter school about 2,000 to 3,000 vocabulary words behind the more achieving counterparts. And it turns out, apropos of what I mentioned earlier, that reading comprehension is a gateway skill, a trajectory, as to what happens to children subsequently. So one of the major activities that I've been involved in has been how to help schools engage in school preparedness, school readiness, to close that initial gap. And improving vocabulary and reading skills is natural. We then extended, and this will get to the instructional procedures as well. We asked teachers from a set of studies. Actually, these studies are published in the recent book I wrote on Evolution of Cognitive Behavior Therapy. So what we did was we asked correct. That you have it, and I will encourage folks to take a look at it. There's my version as well, so we're in good shape. That's so one of the things that becomes interesting in that area is we ask teachers to identify children from grades 1 to 6 who we characterize as nurturant learners, independent learners, and we ask teachers, and your teachers may be interested in identifying similar. Can you give us a name of a student or students in your class who seems to know what to do and can do it without being told? Can you give a name of a student in your class who, for example, if you had a visitor and you want to impress the visitor how you run your class, you would nominate this kid to give the tour. If students were absent from school and you wanted some student in your class to help the student who was absent to explain this child would be nominated.
Yeah.
If you ask peers, for example, if you need help, who do you go to? Okay, so you get a fair amount of agreement of who these kids are. And they're not just more intelligent on IQ tests, but they are what we call self-regulated learners. We then match them with children who were nominated at the other end, and we then follow them in class, recording everything they said to themselves and to peers and teachers, and what peers and teachers said to them. And one of the things we found out is that these nurturing students were able to achieve. The kids who were failing tended to use teachers as a mental crutch. Not only that, teachers handled or treated these children differently.
I didn't catch your previous sentence. I lost it.
Yeah, so what happens is, if you compare the children who are my independent learners, okay, versus their counterparts who are at the other end of the spectrum, those independent learners tend to create a learning environment that reinforces their competencies. They are treated differently by teachers and by peers. Teachers are more likely to ask them questions whereby they could help others. Teachers are more likely to ask these students questions that call for thinking processes that are related to sort of frontal lobe activities. So these students actually create and experience a different learning environment. So by the time they get to high school, the teacher in high school might differ these students in their class by up to 5 or 6 grade differences. They're starting off 1 or 2, but the rich keep getting richer. Now, let's look at the educational implications of this and what we do. So the key question is, A, can we increase teachers' and parents' awareness of how they interact with these children who are independent learners? Can teachers actually do think aloud and modeling procedures? Can teachers take the children who are behind in some ways and put them in a helper mode? We did studies, for instance, of taking children who were struggling in math in 4th grade and teaching them how to be tutors for 2nd graders. That's a very interesting opportunity. So we taught them how to use strategies or metacognitive skills to teach younger children. When they became proficient in doing that, not only did they do that with the younger students, they also did it on their own when they had to do their own tasks. So what differs in terms of independent learners versus those who are not independent learners is the likelihood of their spontaneously using the self-regulatory private speech. That is, they encounter tasks that fall within their repertoire, slightly above, and what that does is free up their thinking processes so that they could perform. Permit me just to give one quick example, okay? Imagine that you have someone who you're trying to teach to ski down a hill.
Yes.
and you are the instructor. Now you take them to a hill that's way beyond their capacity. Or you take them to a hill that they've mastered many times in the past. Neither of those hills will be an occasion. One will elicit boredom if it's too easy. The other will elicit fear. So they have no opportunity to engage in the kind of reflective planning, monitoring, self-evaluating that improves skiing activity. Leave the ski slope for a moment and think about this in the classroom. If the ski slope that students have is just slightly above their level of competence, what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development.
Scaffolding, maybe, as well.
Scaffolding opportunity, okay? That's the period, that's the slope where people learn. So what we've done is when we're teaching math, for instance, we lay out math problems along a level of difficulty and help the students self-select the right math problems to work on, like the right slope. And not only will they master that task, but that will be the occasion for them to reflect and employ their own self-instructions. One of the interventions that followed from all of our work in cognitive behavioral intervention has to do with self-instructional training. Can we teach students various skills like writing or math? And this has even been employed with deaf students as well, to reflect, to monitor their own performance, to plan ahead, to self-interrogate. So, for example, in that Evolutions book, I have included there, for instances, work by Graham and Harris, where they taught, using self-instruction, students how to do problem defining, how to focus attention, how to use strategies, how to self-evaluate, and how to self-reinforce. So what happens is these are guidelines. It's not that they have to parrot back what they've learned, but they need to have a kind of goal, plan, do, check.
Yeah. I see
so
what
much
you mean.
of our work is on how to nurture self-regulation in children.
Well, and you used the word metacognition in your previous answer, and metacognition is also a very important definition, especially when we talk about future skills. Nowadays we talk about lifelong learners, and if you want to become a lifelong learner, I think metacognition is a really important definition. Could you give us your definition of metacognition?
Well, metacognition is essentially thinking about thinking, okay? Each of us has a good deal of knowledge about how our heads work, okay? We know when we don't know something, and we know when not knowing something is important or not. So we have a kind of awareness of our own cognitive capacities, and we have a good deal of knowledge of the variety of factors that influence our thinking processes. Okay, when we're too tired or fatigued or overwhelmed. And most importantly, the other part of metacognition is not only do we have knowledge and awareness, but we have a variety of strategies that we could use in order to perform a given task. And we know when some strategies work and when some don't work. And we can alter that accordingly. So metacognition is essentially the executive routines that we have, and it's highly related to various brain structures, especially the prefrontal cortex. Now, the key question is, if children evidence deficits in this area, can we create metacognitive prosthetic devices?
Exactly.
Okay. And in fact, if your readers go to the Melissa Institute, they will see I have papers there on how to make schools more inviting, pedagogically more effective, and safer. In there are a variety of bottom-up and top-down strategies that teachers can incorporate in a scaffolding fashion. Scaffolding is sort of providing a lot of supports, and as the student develops competencies, the teacher, parent naturally reduces the amount of support. So, look, I have worked for a good deal of time on how these kinds of self-instructional procedures can complement the kind of metacognitive abilities. So it's a way whereby teachers, either one-on-one or small groups, or an entire classroom, can sort of lay out these kinds of rule-regulated behaviors and how they can engineer the environment. I should add one other observation here, and that is students are maybe independent learners in one topic, but not in others. So when we did that naturalistic observation studies in the classroom, we found out that some students would engage in a lot of self-regulatory speech, say in art or painting, but they wouldn't do it on reading or math kinds of skills. And we also found the reverse. So one of the things that becomes interesting is the notion of being an expert is not a characteristic of the child. It is more a characteristic of the transaction between the child and the task that's before them. You go back to my ski hill, skiing may not be your forte,
Yeah.
Okay, and you may, in that situation, not use these metacognitive skills.
I see what you mean. A couple of months ago, I interviewed Donald Hirsch, and he wrote a book called Why Knowledge Matters. And in his book, he says 21st century skills, or any skill, is always attached to subjects. It's not a skill. It's not a subject itself, a skill. You have to know how to read. You have to know history. You have to know English. Without these basic knowledge, your skills are absent. They're not there. So is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that analysis. You could look at any task as a series of steps, okay? And if you're going to be successful at that task, whether it's an academic task or a recreational task, you have to have some kind of executive processes to monitor how well you're doing and to alter strategies accordingly. It's hard in this simple interview to capture it, but if you go to all the people who have applied self-instruction, you'll see that they have, and I suspect good teachers do this, break the task down into its components, and then translate those components into strategies. The name of the game is, how do you get students to take the voice of the teacher and become their own teacher, right? How do you get them to notice, to catch, to interrupt, to monitor, to self-interrogate? If you look at all the work of Anne Brown and Anne Palensar when they were teaching reading comprehension with this reciprocal teaching process that was so successful, they had children internalize. When they were looking at good versus poor readers, you found out the poor readers were less strategic. It wasn't just vocabulary, it wasn't just speed of reading or other kind of basic skills. It was these kinds of executive routines. One of the things I should highlight again is if you can have these students teach younger students, be put in a helper role, then they get an opportunity to exercise this.
You keep stressing the importance of peer activities in education.
Right.
That must be a major success factor in education.
Right, and peer learning is really powerful. The problem is, in our observation, teachers only ask the more competent, independent learners to be helpers, okay? Because they don't teach the less competent learners how to be good teachers. So when we taught students how to be good teachers, how to ask questions of the younger students, how to monitor their performance, how to scaffold and give hints as compared to just the answers. Not only did that help the younger students, but given that they were in that helping role, they internalized those processes when performing their own task. So the younger students tend to use teachers and peers as mental crutches. If you go to the article I have in the Evolutions book, we actually included the scripts, examples of how poor students turn to good peers. Or the other thing that's really neat is that these competent, self-regulating students go, okay, and provide advice to these students. Okay?
That's a great tip for
Yeah.
our viewers.
I'll give you one other key tip, okay? When you are going to get married, you should marry a metacognitive prosthetic device, okay? You need to marry someone who is competent in saying to you, you're going out dressed like that. When's the last time you had a shower, okay?
Oh,
Okay, you think
well,
those
that's
things
the
match?
case.
Okay?
I can
You
assure
try?
that's the case. But please proceed. So why is that?
Well, I mean, these people, I've been married 58 years. Fortunately, my wife, who helped, I'm sorry, my wife in the background saying 54. It seemed like 58. Anyway, so the point is that these people are really very competent. They most likely achieved when they were in the second grade and third grade. So this is a skill that one uses all the time. It's sort of like having a GPS with you. One of these things that say turn here, turn there, that kind of thing. Anyway, that's a sort of tongue-in-cheek example.
Well, thanks for the tip.
Yeah.
You recently published an article called "How to Spot Hype in the Field of Psychotherapy." Why did you publish that article? Could you tell us a bit more about the article and why it's important for education as well to pay attention to it?
So I wear two hats. One sort of developmental psychologist that takes me through all of the studies on independent learners, on consultation with teachers, self-instructional training. But I also wear another hat, which is a clinical hat on treating people with a variety of disorders, especially post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and the like. And when your attendees go to the website, they could read much of that. I supervise and consult at various psychiatric facilities for children, adolescents, and adults. The field of psychotherapy, to use the proper term, is filled with a lot of BS, okay? Where people make exaggerated claims for the efficacy of what they're doing. They bathe their interventions with psychobabble and neurobabble. They advocate and push procedures that have very little evidence-based basis to it. So I have been a critic of that line. The Melissa Institute is designed to give science away, to use evidence-based interventions. So the article that appeared in the Professional Psychology actually generated a 19-item checklist so that before someone embraces a therapeutic procedure, they could do a kind of consumer's guide and see if, in fact, the people making these claims have any basis to them. That particular article on how to spot hype in the field of psychotherapy, a 19-item checklist, is on the Melissa Institute website. And I encourage your folks who do psychotherapy to take a look at that. Unfortunately, a similar exaggerated claims and procedures that have very little evidence are directed at schools, at least in the United States.
In Holland as well.
Well, so for example, I just gave a presentation that's online on how to bolster resilience in high-risk children and their families. And I included in there examples of various kinds of hype that are directed at schools. So there's this procedure called tapping, where they get kids to tap various things, various kinds of mindfulness. There are various neural clinics by Dr. Amen and so forth, all of which I think are very dubious and questionable. Unfortunately, schools uncritically accept these and spend limited dollars on procedures that I think are very dubious. So my checklist that I put together for psychotherapy is as applicable to educators, to principals, superintendents, school boards, and the like. So I think teachers, if you want to nurture metacognition in kids, you need to make sure that teachers and superintendents and principals have metacognitive skills, that they really ask critical questions about that which they're about to embrace.
What you told me as well, what I saw in one of your previous interviews, is that also PhD students and doctors attend such meetings.
Yes,
so apparently there is a very strong marketing.
Having a PhD, okay, does not inoculate or protect you from hype, okay?
How come? Why? You're a doctor. You're a scientist.
Yeah,
for Pete's sake.
Right. And in fact, there is a lovely article called "Love Yourself as a Person, but Doubt Yourself as a Therapist." Okay, and in this article, they studied therapists who never characterized themselves as experts, and moreover, were self-doubters all along the way. Okay, they did the best they could. They worked on therapeutic alliance. Those therapists, those PhD types, who were self-questioning, who had metacognitive skills, got much better results than those who believed that they were advocating a specific therapeutic procedure. So, the level of curiosity and self-interrogation and so forth that characterized my independent learners, as you noted at the outset, this is a lifelong skill. And the name of the game is to nurture those processes.
I'll make sure it gets translated. I will translate the list for my Dutch readers, so everybody has the opportunity.
Send me that copy.
I will send you the copy of the list. I'll make sure everybody gets it, because I think that's one of the most important issues in psychotherapy, but also in education, because we need to focus on what one of my interviewees, Michael Funden, calls the right drivers. We need to focus on what works and what is scientifically proven, or at least research that has been done on it. So let's make sure that happens.
Yeah.
So to summarize all the topics we've discussed, could you tell us once more where can my readers and viewers find all the information?
Well, I think that the Melissa Institute website is a good beginning resource, because it has not only much of what we've talked about, but also has presentations by many other people who I hold in high regard, who have presented. So, and in each of the papers that I have there, I have additional links to references and the like. So I have, my daughters are teachers, my daughter-in-laws are teachers. I spend a lot of time in schools. From my point of view, the most important person in the school, after working for 40 years, is the principal. Okay, the principal sort of sets the tone. In the United States, nothing really happens without the principal's input. So we have put together a checklist in this toolkit on how principals can make a significant difference in creating a safe and inviting environment. We've put on there ways in which principals can engage parents. In the Nurturing Independent Learners book, there's a checklist where you can evaluate how good schools are in reaching out to parents, because they're critical in terms of the success. We've included in there how principals and school communities can work together. In the latest issue, I included a description of Iceland. The country Iceland has a model of prevention that is being used in several European countries. And these are sort of community-wide prevention procedures. I'll give you one final example that I use all the time with teachers, if I may. I say to teachers, imagine in your school you have children who have been physically confined to a wheelchair, okay? And they have some physical disability that you could see. Now, for some reason, your school has not provided them with the prosthetic devices to negotiate successfully your school environment. So there's no ramp to get their wheelchair up, okay? There is no stick by the elevator to press the button, okay? The bathrooms do not have supports that they can use. The shoes that you've given them are complicated shoelaces as compared to just Velcro. You, the teacher, would never go to that child and say, do not give me any excuses. Do not give me any lip. Get that wheelchair up those 4 stairs and do not be late, okay? Instead, you, the teacher, would say, oh, excuse me, to the student. We, as educators, have a deficit. We have failed to provide you, the student, with the necessary prosthetic devices, tools to negotiate this, like a ramp, like a stick by the elevator. Now imagine, I say to the teachers I'm lecturing, that you have students entering your school, but who look normal. But prior to coming into your school, they have been exposed to multiple adverse childhood experiences of abuse, neglect, dysfunctional parents. What prosthetic devices do you think those students need? They are entering your school not only with deprivations in language development and school readiness, but there are neurological sequelae of having that kind of high exposure. So the left side of their brain is less developed than the right side. That they are more responsive to the lower brain part, amygdala hijacking the frontal lobe, okay? These students who look normal need metacognitive prosthetic devices. They need mental ramps. They need self-instructional training. They need memory prompts. They need an environment that reduces attention. They need support. They need reaching out to parents to be a homeschool link. My message to your audience is, can we identify at the outset those students who are high risk, and can we help them become independent learners over the course? We as educators have a deficit. It's not the kids. They're coming in with a certain level of competence or incompetence. It's our job to try and provide, just like with the wheelchairs, these students. Remember, they look normal, okay? And if you look at my latest handouts on the conference that we just had, you'll be able to read more about what these metacognitive prosthetic devices are.
Very interesting, but also very interesting for me to know is, how do you identify those students as a school? Because they look normal when they enter your school, and problems will occur later on in the year when it's maybe too late. So you need instruments
I mean,
to.
that's a really good question. Okay, so some of the kinds of ways to assess it is to do ecological assessment. You can ascertain developmentally which children have been exposed to these adverse childhood experiences. Okay, there may be records that get passed on from preschool or
Yes.
what have you on that are there. So we could sort of say, what's the ecological assessment that would be part of that process? Okay. The second kind of assessment is that you can identify, for example, with the level of cognitive functioning, school readiness, simple kinds of social skills. So if you think about socialization, in beginning of schools, in terms of vocabulary, turn taking, following rules, teachers are pretty good early on identifying which kids need those kinds of supports. All along the way, we've also identified other risk factors that you could read about in terms of school connectedness and other kinds of peer nomination procedures. The key question is not only the identification, let's say you're successful then. The key question is, what services are you going to provide those students and their families?
Sure.
Okay? To identify and have no follow-up is more problematic.
Yeah, I agree.
So the key question is, what's the nature of the supports that these children are going to receive?
This is a really relevant topic for the Netherlands as well. Could you tell us the title of the paper again and where to find it?
If you go to the Melissa Institute website, on the home page, hit resources, and then go down to author index, that'll take you to papers by me, and you'll be able to see several papers on how to create a nurturing environment.
But especially about identifying those students.
Right. If you go to the toolkit that we just put on there in terms of school safety, there is a list there of how to identify high-risk kids.
Great.
Okay? But most importantly, how to provide services thereafter.
Great.
Yeah, so
well, we are reaching the end of the interview, and I would like to end with a few personal questions. One is, who or what inspires you outside the field of psychotherapy? Because people always link you to the field of psychotherapy, and when they interview you, it's always about psychotherapy or related to it. But you are more than just a psychotherapist. You're a human being as well. And what inspires you as a human being? Music, food, books, people?
Well, I guess the major inspiration for me is family. So I have 4 children and 7 grandchildren. So being part of their lives is in fact rather stimulating to me. In fact, if your audience is interested, they can go on the Melissa Institute and see another interview that I gave telling the story about my mother and how she's the origins of cognitive behavior there, which is kind of a fun story.
Which is also in the book.
Yes, it is. It's included there too, but the interview is more fun.
Yeah.
The other kinds of things is, I'm now 78 years of age, and therefore I would like to have a world come to be where students are safe. You started with the question about gun violence in schools, and we were more successful. So, given all my work for the Melissa Institute, this is, total charitable on my part. I don't get a salary or anything. Is, can I give back? Can I make the world safer? So that's really my mission, So I see a particular social problem, and I bring whatever knowledge and expertise and psychotherapeutic skills to bear on this problem, and this may apply to how to make politicians more metacognitively competent, or whether it's dealing with students becoming more metacognitively competent. In the political domain, I have a paper there on how the world would be different if there was someone who's an expert on decision making or cognitive behavior therapy sitting in on the cabinet of every president or prime minister. So instead of waiting for them to make an error and then having journalists and historians, could you actually have someone right on the premises pointing this out? In fact, if you want a fun thing to do, you can read my paper on how to do therapy with the president.
That must be fun.
I don't want to get too political.
Just the title. Is
it's interesting to think about. I have listed the dirty dozen errors that politicians make that get us into war.
Oh, okay? Right.
Really, and the key question is, could you actually inoculate people in that power position to learn from the lessons of previous presidents? So my preoccupation with metacognition goes all the way from preschools up to presidents.
I see what you mean. But still, if I were in your house and I would have a look at your bookshelf, what kind of books or CDs would I find?
Well, in terms of books, I tend to read more nonfiction than fiction. My clinical cases are as good as the fiction that I read. So I read essentially nonfiction books that deal with history and governmental decisions, and I read a lot of biographies on people who are high risk and make it in spite of. I did a whole book on Roadmap to Resilience, which is all about how people make it in spite of. That fascinates me. If you look at any particular traumatic event, whether it is natural disasters, whether it's combat, whether it's some kind of victimization, while most people are impacted, the data is overwhelming that 75% of people will be impacted but go on in evidence resilience. 25% of people get stuck. So one of my preoccupations is what distinguishes the 25% from the 75%, and what can we do to help that? In terms of music, I'm a big fan of jazz. So I have I listen to a lot of jazz.
Could you name an artist?
Oscar Peterson or Jared or
old school
or King. All of these folks. I listen to much of that. So
great.
And that's really interesting because that's a high metacognitive skill, jazz, in terms of improvising the way these people come together. We did work on creativity and so forth. So that fascinates me a great deal. I'm not sure if I'm getting close to your concerns, but
yes, it is. It is. My penultimate question is: what are your ambitions for the future? What are your plans? Are you going to write a new book? Are you still into research? What does it look like?
I have been involved in training therapists and educators for a long time, and we have a lot of material that we have developed for teachers. For instance, we've developed this model of instruction that's described in the Nurturing Independent Learners book, where we developed these kind of interesting tools for teachers on how they could engineer their instruction in a way that children pick the right slope. If I go back to that example, the way in which they can generalize and transfer. So my hope is to take all of the experiences and training we've done and perhaps put it in some kind of app, some kind of computer-based function that people can download. So when we say teachers should do modeling, what does that look like? Or teachers should have an environment that's rule-generated. So if you go to the various websites, there's a lot of material, but it's not in the most user-friendly fashion. So the key question is, if you want a specific activity in order to nurture metacognitive skills, you'd be able to click on it. What's the art of questioning? How can teachers give praise that reinforce? So if I say to you, this was a really good plan, okay? You really knew how to put this together. Clearly you asked yourself the questions you want to ask me, teacher. I mean, so I could praise you for conducting this interview. Okay? But in my praise, I could bathe my praise with words like, so you were able to plan this? Tell me how you did that, okay? I mean, and then you had to put together these questions within the time limit. So did you are you saying to me, are you saying to yourself that you actually asked yourself these questions beforehand? I mean, and as we went along, you were able to monitor and catch me when I was going off target. You were able to keep it going. I mean, how did you do that? Okay, so I could praise your performance, just like a teacher could praise a student's performance, and bathe my observations with metacognitive verbs.
I see what you mean.
Okay, so, but not only am I going to praise you, I'm going to ask you, what advice would you have for someone else who wants to conduct these kinds of interviews? Okay? How did you come to the decision to conduct these interviews, to collect all these people? Share with us the good judgment that you had in inviting me to participate. You know, right?
So,
I mean, that kind of questioning of you would be very valuable. Okay? Because you are an independent learner. Now, if you I would rarely ask you those questions because you wouldn't be able to give me good answers. And I have a whole class and I don't have time to waste.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call on someone who's going to give the right answer that's a model to the rest of the students. That's what gets people falling further and further behind.
So to summarize, you are giving away science, but in a comprehensive, in an easy manner. Let's say an app. So that's something we can expect maybe in the future.
I hope so.
But that's what you just said.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, you know, that's a good thing. I got, you know, I got to go to a soccer match this afternoon and a hockey match tomorrow. I got to squeeze these activities in between 7 grandkids. Okay, I mean, you know, I do the best I can.
I always ask my interviewees if you were to interview someone, who would it be? Who inspires you? And maybe in the field of education or research that has a great influence or benefit to education, who should I interview next?
You want to know who I want to living or dead?
If you were in my shoes, if you were in my shoes as an interviewer,
so you need someone live. Okay. So one of the things that I would suggest is I have an unbelievable scientific board on the Melissa Institute. Okay, so there's a woman named Deb Pepler in Canada who runs this thing called PrevNet, okay, .ca, and she has organized the entire country to address the issue of bullying. Okay, and just getting her to tell you the story of all of her observations on bullying and how it leads to violence, I think your audience would be terrific. There's a guy named James Larson, Larson, who's on my board, who has done work on school preparedness, what these kids need to do to success, and he's also done work on cognitive behavioral interventions on anger control. They would be both very good people. There's a woman named Marlene Wong, W-O-N-G, and she has developed cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in the schools. I mean, the board's replete. Ron Slabby has created Eyes on Bullying. You know, so there are a number of people who I turned to when I was putting on the toolkit, who I think would be really good folks for you to interview and that your audience would benefit from.
That's a great lead. So let me end this interview by saying thanks on behalf of my viewers, on behalf of my readers, on behalf of all the teachers that apply your work in classrooms, because your work is bigger in Holland than you probably know, and I'll inform you later on about all the practices that are going on in the Netherlands. It must be really interesting.
I'm open for an invitation to visit Holland again, visit the Netherlands.
That would be
if any of your audience wants to contact me apropos of that, that would be
great.
delightful.
So mention your email once again for the viewers.
DHMEICH@AOL.com.
Great. It will be
DHMEICH@AOL.com.
I'll make sure it's in the description box, as the link to the website. And let me end by saying that this is a must-read for everybody, also for teachers, because there are some very valuable chapters for teachers as well. Chapter 4, 5, 6 are all about students and self-instruction and metacognitive skills. So for everybody, this is a must-read. Don, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm glad we worked it out.
For your time. And hope to see you in the future.
Yes.
Bye-bye.